This is for you, my love." Adrian Vale's voice cut through 500 conversations like a blade. Every head turned. He was standing in the center of the ballroom holding a diamond necklace worth $12 million, and he was fastening it around his mistress's neck, slowly, publicly, while his wife stood 30 feet away, the woman who had saved his empire, the woman whose money had paid for those diamonds. Evelyn Vale did not scream, did not move. She simply watched her husband gift another woman a crown, built from everything she had sacrificed. Subscribe now, comment your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The night Adrian Vale made the worst decision of his life, the weather in New York was perfect. That was the cruel irony of it. The sky was clear. The November air carried just enough chill to make the women's gowns look intentional, and the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom had never looked more beautiful. Crystal chandeliers threw light across the room like scattered diamonds. Waitstaff moved in quiet, practiced rhythms. Somewhere near the east entrance, a string quartet played something soft and European that no one was really listening to. 500 of New York's most powerful people had gathered for the Meridian Charitable Foundation Gala. The kind of event where $10,000 plates were purchased not for the food, but for the visibility. Where who you sat next to mattered more than what you said. Where reputations were made and unmade between the appetizer and the main course. Evelyn Vale arrived at 7:45, which was exactly on time, which meant she was by Manhattan Gala standards 15 minutes early. She wore midnight blue, a structured gown that said wealth without announcing it. No excessive jewelry, a single bracelet on her left wrist, thin and gold. She had chosen it herself, which was a decision she made for everything in her life. She moved through the room the way she always did, with the kind of quiet, assured presence that people registered without being able to explain. She wasn't loud. She wasn't performing. But when Evelyn Vale walked into a space, something in the room rearranged itself slightly, the way furniture seems to shift when a window opens and lets in air. She shook hands. She kissed cheeks. She said the right things to the right people at exactly the right moments. Senator Hargrove's wife commented on her gown. Evelyn thanked her and asked about the senator's work on the infrastructure bill, which she had read about that morning at 5:30 while Adrian was still asleep. The senator's wife blinked surprised, then brightened, because most people at this event asked about the gown and stopped there. That was Evelyn. She was always listening, always 2 questions ahead. Her husband arrived at 8:15, which was fashionably late by his own private standard. Adrian Vale, at 52, was the kind of man who had learned to wear success like a second skin. 6 feet 2 silver at the temples in a way that his publicist had once called distinguished, and that Adrian had never disputed. He moved through rooms with the particular ease of a man who had never once doubted that the room was there for him. He shook hands firmly, laughed at his own jokes first, and had perfected the art of making eye contact in a way that made the person across from him feel chosen, right up until the moment he needed something from them, at which point the eye contact became a tool rather than a gift. He had built Vale International from a mid-sized real estate company into a multi-sector conglomerate worth, by the latest Forbes estimate, somewhere north of $4 billion. He had not built it alone. But he had learned to forget that. He came in through the main entrance, and the room noticed because the room always noticed Adrian Vale. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit that Evelyn's assistant had selected 2 weeks ago, and a tie the color of old money. He looked objectively like power. He looked like exactly what he wanted everyone to see. What Evelyn noticed in the practiced and private way she noticed everything was that he was not alone. Camille Laurent was 29 years old, French-born, Manhattan-polished, and had been described in the one gossip column that had dared to name her as breathtakingly decorative. She wore red. Of course she wore red. The dress was constructed to be noticed low in the back, precise in the front, the kind of garment that required absolute confidence to carry, and that Camille carried without apparent effort. She walked in half a step behind Adrian, which was close enough to signal intimacy and far enough to maintain the thin technical deniability that Adrian had apparently decided tonight he no longer needed. Because when he entered the room, he did not leave Camille at the edge of the crowd. He did not introduce her vaguely as an associate or deposit her with a group of people who wouldn't ask questions. He walked her to the center of the room, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a velvet case. The moment the case appeared, something happened in the room. It was not a sound. It was the absence of sound, a subtle collective inhale that moved through the crowd like a wave. People turned. People who had been in the middle of sentences stopped mid-word. Waitstaff slowed. Adrian opened the case. The necklace inside caught the chandelier light immediately, a cascade of diamonds set in platinum, the center stone large enough to be obscene, brilliant enough to be blinding. It was the kind of jewelry that did not exist to be beautiful. It existed to make a statement. And Adrian Vale, with 500 people watching, lifted that necklace and fastened it around Camille Laurent's neck. His hands were steady. He was smiling. He was performing, and he knew it, and he did not care. Camille reached up and touched the stones with her fingertips, and the smile she gave him was the kind that contains a private joke, the kind shared between two people who believe in this moment that they have won something. Evelyn was 30 feet away. She had been in conversation with Hargrove and a telecommunications executive named Brandt when the shift in the room's energy reached her. She had learned over decades of navigating rooms like this one to read atmospheric changes the way a sailor reads wind by feel before it becomes visible. She turned. She saw her husband's hands. She saw the necklace. She saw Camille's smile. She saw the entire room watching her. And she did something that no one in that ballroom expected. Nothing. Evelyn Vale's face did not change. She did not pale. She did not flush. Her jaw did not tighten. Her eyes did not fill. She held the gaze of the spectacle across the room for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to confirm what she was seeing, and then she turned back to Hargrove and Brandt and said with perfect composure, "I'm sorry, you were saying something about the Eastern Corridor." Brandt stared at her. He genuinely could not process what he was witnessing. Hargrove, who was 71 years old and had seen more political theater than most people had lived through, looked at Evelyn Vale in that moment with something approaching reverence. "Mrs. Vale," Brandt said, unable to stop himself. Did you just—" "I'm fine, Gerald," she said quietly, and her voice was so steady, so absolutely unbroken, that Brandt closed his mouth. "Finish your thought." But of course no one finished their thoughts that night. Not really. The gala continued, the speeches were given, the auction items were sold, the dinner was served, but the event had already reached its defining moment, and everyone knew it. The Whisper Network activated within minutes. By 9 o'clock, people were texting each other across the room. By 9:30, 3 different gossip accounts had received anonymous tips. Adrian, for his part, seemed to grow more animated as the evening progressed, as though the public nature of what he'd done had filled him with a particular kind of energy. He moved through the room with Camille at his side, introducing her to people without explanation, as if the introduction itself was the statement he'd been waiting months to make. He did not speak to Evelyn once. Evelyn, for her part, stayed at the gala until 10:15. She did not leave early. She did not make a scene. She said her goodbyes with warmth and precision, thanked the Foundation's director for a beautiful evening, and walked out through the main entrance with the same composed grace with which she had entered. The car was waiting. She got in. The door closed. The driver pulled away from the curb. And for exactly 45 seconds, the time it took to turn off Fifth Avenue and onto a side street where no one could see, Evelyn Vale sat in the back of that car with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes closed and her face absolutely still. Then she opened her eyes, and she took out her phone and typed a single message to a contact listed only as RP. "It's time. Begin the review. Time." She put the phone face down on the seat beside her and looked out the window at the city moving past, and her expression was not grief. It was not rage. It was something older and quieter than both of those things, the look of a person who has been patient for a very long time and has just made a decision that cannot be unmade. People who knew Evelyn Vale well, and very few people did, would have told you that she was not a woman who made decisions in moments of emotion. They would have told you that she was instead a woman who observed, who cataloged, who built structures out of information the way other people build structures out of steel. They would have told you that if Evelyn Vale decided something, it was not because she had been pushed to it. It was because she had been ready for it for longer than anyone realized, and they would have been right. What Adrian Vale had never understood about his wife, not in 23 years of marriage, not through the financial crises and the boardroom battles and the late nights when she had quietly solved problems he didn't even know existed, was that Evelyn's stillness was not passivity. It was preparation. She had grown up in Cincinnati, the middle child of a tax attorney father and a mother who ran a small but meticulous accounting firm out of a converted Victorian house on Elm Street, Money in the Wade household. Evelyn's maiden name was Wade was not discussed as a luxury. It was discussed as a language. Her father used to say that most people treated finance like weather, something that happened to them. He believed it was something you learned to read, to predict, to navigate. He had taught his children accordingly. By 16, Evelyn could read a balance sheet the way other teenagers read novels. By 22, she had a master's degree in financial economics from the University of Chicago and a job offer from one of the 3 largest private equity firms in the country. She did not take the job. She took a position instead at a mid-sized consulting firm in Manhattan at a significantly lower salary because she had done her research and identified the firm as the kind of place where young analysts were given actual work rather than administrative proximity to actual work, where you could learn the whole machine rather than one gear. She was right. Within 4 years, she was the youngest senior analyst in the firm's history. Within 6, she was being recruited by clients directly. It was through one of those clients that she met Adrian Vale. He was 31 at the time. The company his father had left him was worth approximately $240 million on paper and approximately $60 million in actual salvageable value. Adrian knew how to sell. He knew how to charm. He knew how to walk into a room and make people want to give him things. What he did not know, what he had never had to learn, because his father had done it for him and his natural gifts had allowed him to avoid it, was how to build the structural foundation beneath the charm. He was bleeding money in 7 different directions and didn't fully understand why. Evelyn understood it within 48 hours of reviewing his books. She laid it out for him in a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon, the debt ratios, the over-leveraged acquisitions, the cash flow misalignments, the 3 partnerships that were quietly draining equity while appearing to generate revenue. She was precise, unemotional, and thorough. Adrian stared at her across the table. "Can it be fixed?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "But you need to stop making decisions without looking at the numbers first." He had laughed at that. "You make it sound simple." "The concept is simple," she said. "The execution requires discipline." He had looked at her for a moment in a way that she had been too professional to interpret at the time. Later, she would understand that he had been calculating not in the cynical sense, but in the particular way that certain people calculate when they recognize something they need, something they don't have and can't manufacture. He had seen in Evelyn Wade in that conference room a capability that no charm or charisma could replace. He had seen the one thing his empire was missing. He had asked her to dinner 3 days later. She had gone, not because she was swept away. Evelyn was rarely swept away by anything, but because she was curious about a mind that could be so brilliant in some directions and so stubbornly blind in others. It was the kind of contradiction she found genuinely interesting. They were married 18 months later, and in the years that followed, Evelyn did what she had always done. She built, quietly, systemically, with the patience of someone who understood that the most durable structures are the ones that take the longest to construct. She restructured the debt. She negotiated the partnerships. She identified acquisition targets that Adrian could then charm investors into funding. She was never in the spotlight. That was not her preference. The spotlight was Adrian's territory, and she understood this arrangement without needing to discuss it. What she also understood, though this understanding had come gradually through years of quiet observation, was that Adrian had begun to confuse the arrangement with reality. He had begun to believe that he was the empire rather than the face of the empire, that the $1 billion existed because of his charisma rather than in spite of its tendencies. She had noticed this the way she noticed everything carefully without announcing it. She had watched as the gratitude that had characterized their early years together slowly transformed into assumption, as he stopped asking her opinion and started assuming she would execute whatever he had already decided. as the partnership became in his mind a hierarchy with him at the top and her somewhere beneath him, performing a supporting function that he had apparently ceased to regard as extraordinary. She had noted this, filed it, and continued working, because that was what Evelyn did, until the night of the gala, until the moment he fastened $12 million worth of diamonds around another woman's throat in front of 500 witnesses, until the moment that was not in itself the breaking point, because Evelyn Vale did not have breaking points, but was instead the moment she recognized that she had been patient long enough. The morning after this gala, Adrian did not come home until 11:30. He walked into the kitchen of their Central Park West penthouse with the particular energy of a man who has decided that the best defense is a kind of brazen nonchalance, as though if he acts normally enough, the preceding 12 hours might simply not require acknowledgement. Evelyn was at the kitchen island with coffee and a document she was reading. She did not look up when he came in. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she replied. He poured himself coffee. He stood at the counter. He waited. After a long moment, he said, "We should probably talk about last night." "Should we?" Evelyn turned a page of her document. "Evelyn." His voice took on the slightly wounded register that she recognized as his opening gambit in conversations he expected to be difficult. "I know how it looked." "I'm sure you do," she said. Her tone was completely neutral. "You've always had excellent spatial awareness." He set his coffee down. "That's not fair." "I'm not sure fairness is what we're discussing." "I made a mistake," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't, but Camille and I, it's complicated, and I think if you just let me explain—" "Adrian." Evelyn closed the document. She looked up at him for the first time. Her eyes were clear and direct and utterly without drama. "I don't need you to explain Camille. I've known about Camille for 11 months. The silence in the kitchen was immediate and total. Adrian stared at her. "You've known," he repeated. "Yes." "For 11 months. Closer to 11 and a half, but yes." He opened his mouth, closed it. A muscle moved in his jaw. "Then why haven't you said something?" She lifted her coffee cup. "Because I was watching to see what you'd do with it, whether it was a moment of stupidity that you'd correct, whether you had any capacity left for judgment." She set the cup down precisely. "Last night answered my question." "Evelyn, this is not. You can't just—" "I'm not angry, Adrian," she said. And the fact that this was true, that her voice carried no heat, no tremor, no grievance, seemed to disturb him more than anger would have. "I want you to understand that. I'm not going to throw things. I'm not going to cry. I'm not going to make a scene." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to do what I always do. I'm going to look at the situation, clearly assess the structure, and make appropriate decisions." He studied her face, and for the first time she could see something flicker behind his eyes that was not arrogance or calculation. It was something older and less comfortable. Something that looked briefly like fear. "What does that mean?" he asked. "What decisions?" That, she said, picking her document back up, "is what I'm working on." He stood in the kitchen for another moment, and she could feel him trying to find the right thing to say, the version of this conversation in which he regained the upper hand. He was a man who relied on his ability to read rooms and redirect narratives, and he was discovering not for the first time, but perhaps more acutely than ever before, that Evelyn was a room he could not read. "I want to fix this," he finally said. The words came out slightly off balance, which meant they were probably true. "I know you do," Evelyn said without looking up. "You always want to fix things after you've broken them. It's one of your most consistent qualities." He left the kitchen. She turned another page. Chuck. What happened in the 3 weeks following the gala was on the surface unremarkable. Evelyn continued her daily routine with the same disciplined precision she brought to everything. She was at her desk by 6. She exercised at 7:30. She took meetings, managed the quiet network of financial relationships she had built over 2 decades, and attended to the dozen or so private advisory relationships she maintained under her own name and under structures that Adrian knew existed, but had never examined closely enough to understand. He was distracted in those 3 weeks trying to manage the fallout from the gala, navigating the suddenly complicated terrain of his public image dealing with Camille, who had apparently not anticipated that the necklace would generate quite this level of visibility. He was making calls and giving interviews, and doing what Adrian Vale did when he felt the ground shifting beneath him, performing, projecting confidence, filling the air with noise. He was not paying attention to Evelyn, which was, of course, exactly what she had counted on. Rowan Pierce arrived in New York on a Tuesday, 12 days after the gala. He was 44 years old, British-born, and carried himself with the kind of unassuming precision that made him invisible in most rooms, which was, professionally speaking, an asset of considerable value. He was a restructuring specialist and a forensic financial analyst, and he had known Evelyn Vale for 16 years, dating back to a deal in London where she had identified a series of misrepresentations in an acquisition structure that had saved his client $400 million, and had in the process demonstrated to Rowan that Evelyn Wade Vale was someone he would spend the rest of his career considering it a privilege to know. They met at a small restaurant in the West Village that had no Michelin stars and no outdoor seating and no celebrity associations, the kind of place where two people could have a long, serious conversation without anyone recording it. Rowan ordered tea. Evelyn ordered the soup. They did not waste time. "The acquisition capital," he said. "You've confirmed it." "2 independent reviews," she said. "The necklace purchase was routed through the Meridian subsidiary account. Restricted funds. The covenant language is clear personal expenditure. Classification triggers default provisions." Rowan was quiet for a moment. He didn't know. He knew the funds were restricted. He didn't think it would be traced. She paused. He stopped, thinking carefully. That's been happening for a while. And the rest of it? Evelyn opened a folder. She set it on the table between them. 31 million approximately, over 3 years, some of it traceable to Camille directly, some of it indirect apartment travel professional positioning, all of it documented. Rowan looked at the summary page for a long moment. He did not whistle. He was not the kind of man who whistled, but something in his expression registered the number with appropriate gravity. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "if you push this, if this goes to the board, there's no version of this that doesn't become very public." "I know." "And you're certain?" She looked at him across the table. "Rowan, what he did that night, the necklace, the performance, the deliberate public humiliation, that was a message. It was him telling me and telling everyone watching that I don't matter, that I can be dismissed, that the 23 years and everything I built for that company can simply be," she paused, choosing the word with care, "accessorized over." She closed the folder. "I want him to understand what he dismissed," she said. "Not out of revenge, because it's true. And because if the board doesn't understand the structural reality of that company who actually holds what and why, then the empire is going to collapse on its own within 5 years anyway. And a lot of people who had nothing to do with Adrian's choices are going to suffer for it." Rowan studied her for a moment. "And Larkspur?" At the mention of Larkspur Holdings, something shifted almost imperceptibly in Evelyn's expression. Not quite a smile, the echo of one. "Larkspur," she said, "is ready." Rowan nodded slowly. He had known about Larkspur for 6 years. He was one of 4 people in the world who knew the full structure of it, what it was, what it held, and most critically what it had done for Vale International 11 years ago, when Adrian's company had come within 72 hours of a catastrophic collapse that would have erased everything. He had marveled at it then. He marveled at it still. "He really has no idea," Rowan said. It wasn't quite a question. "He has never asked," Evelyn said simply, "and I have never volunteered." She picked up her spoon and returned to her soup, and there was something in the gesture. The quiet return to ordinary things. The complete absence of drama that made Rowan Pierce feel, not for the first time, that he was sitting across from a woman whose particular kind of intelligence was rarer than anything he'd encountered in 30 years of working at the highest levels of global finance. "One question," he said. She looked up. "Are you okay?" The question hung between them for a moment. Not the professional question, but the human one. The one that cut through the forensic reviews and the covenant language and the Larkspur structure and went to the actual center of what this was. 23 years, a marriage, whatever had existed, however it had changed, however long she had been watching it change. Evelyn Vale set her spoon down. She looked at Rowan Pierce, and for a moment, just a moment, something in her face was not composed. It was not broken, but it was honest. "I will be," she said. And then she picked up the folder again, and they went back to work. The message Evelyn sent to Rowan Pierce that night, 4 words: "It's time. Begin the review." Set in motion something that Adrian Vale would not see coming until it was already too late to stop. But that was 3 weeks away, and in the world of high finance, 3 weeks is both an eternity and nothing at all. The morning after Evelyn's meeting with Rowan in the West Village, she was at her desk at 5:58, 2 minutes before her usual start time. She had slept 4 hours. She did not consider this a problem. She had trained herself over years to treat sleep as a resource to be managed rather than a comfort to be sought. You took what the situation allowed and you worked with what remained. Her desk faced the window. Central Park stretched below her, gray and quiet in the early November light. She did not look at it. She was looking at a spreadsheet that represented 11 years of careful, layered financial architecture, the kind of structure that from the outside looked like a supporting wall, and from the inside was actually the foundation. Her phone rang at 6:12. She looked at the screen. It was her sister Dana calling from Cincinnati. Dana was 51, a high school chemistry teacher, and the only person in Evelyn's life who had known her before Manhattan, before Adrian, before the Empire, and the galas, and the diamond necklaces that other women wore in public. Evelyn picked up. "I saw it," Dana said without preamble. "It's everywhere. Instagram, Twitter, 3 different news sites. Evelyn, I know," Evelyn said. "Are you okay?" "You're the second person to ask me that this week." "Because we're worried about you. Because what he did was—" "Dana." Evelyn's voice was quiet but firm. "I need you to trust me right now. I need you to trust that I am handling this in the way that makes the most sense. Can you do that?" A pause. Dana knew her sister. She had known her for 53 years, and she understood that Evelyn's composure was not numbness, it was construction. It was a woman building something even while the ground shifted. "Yes," Dana said, "I can do that, but Evie, call me. When it's over, whatever over looks like, call me." "I will," Evelyn said. "I love you." She hung up, and for exactly 11 seconds, she sat with her hands flat on the desk and her eyes closed. Then she opened a new document and began typing. What she was building in those early morning hours while Adrian slept in the guest room and the city woke up around her was a timeline, not an emotional one, a financial one, a precise, documented, legally structured account of every transaction, every decision, every governance violation that had occurred at Vale International over the past 4 years, organized not as an accusation, but as a fact pattern. The kind of fact pattern that a board of directors properly presented with it would have no choice but to act on. She had been collecting these facts for longer than she had told Rowan, longer really than she had admitted to herself, because there is a particular self-protective instinct in human beings, even the most rational, most clear-eyed ones, that delays the act of assembling evidence of a betrayal until the betrayal becomes undeniable, until the body of proof exceeds the desire to explain it away. The necklace had exceeded it. $12 million in diamonds was not the wound was the smile. Adrian had smiled while he fastened that necklace. He had smiled at Camille, and then for just a fraction of a second, almost too brief to catch, he had looked across the room at Evelyn. And he had kept smiling, as though her presence there, her witnessing of it, was part of the pleasure. That was the moment she knew. Not that he had failed her, she had known that for years, but that he had stopped fearing her judgment entirely, that in his mind she had become so thoroughly background, so completely taken for granted, that he no longer felt the need to perform even the minimal theater of respect. He had forgotten what she was. She intended to remind him. By 7:15, she had completed the first draft of the timeline. She sent it to Rowan with a single line: initial structure, cross-reference against the Q3 audit reports and the Meridian subsidiary accounts. I want the covenant language mapped to specific transactions by Friday. Rowan's response came back in 4 minutes. Already started. You're going to want to see the Meridian account more closely. There's something in there beyond the necklace. Evelyn stared at that message for a moment. Then she typed, "How much more?" His response, "I'll call you at noon." She put the phone down She stood up. She went to make a second cup of coffee, moving through the penthouse with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had lived in this space for 16 years and knew every inch of it, who had chosen every piece of furniture, negotiated the purchase, overseen the renovation, built the home that Adrian inhabited as though it had simply appeared for his convenience. She stood in the kitchen and drank her coffee and thought about Rowan's message. Something beyond the necklace. She had known academically that the necklace was likely not an isolated incident. A man who spends $12 million from restricted acquisition capital on a piece of jewelry for his mistress does not do so in a financial vacuum. That kind of decision, that particular combination of arrogance and carelessness, rarely exists as a single data point. She had known, but hearing it confirmed even obliquely, even in a forward message from a man she trusted completely, produced something in her chest that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction. It was the particular feeling of a hypothesis being validated, of a structure she had suspected was there turning out to be real. She finished her coffee. She went back to her desk. She waited for noon. Adrian came out of the guest room at 9:45. She heard him in the hallway, his footsteps, his particular rhythm, the slight drag of the left foot that he'd had since a skiing accident in his late 30s. She knew his sounds, the way you know the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough automatically without thinking, as information rather than feeling. He appeared in the doorway of her office. He was dressed, he had showered, he was carrying his phone and his coffee and wearing the expression of a man who had rehearsed something. "I'm going into the office," he said. "All right," she said. "We need to have a real conversation, Evelyn. Not like yesterday morning, a real one." She looked up from her screen. "When you're ready for a real conversation, Adrian, I'll be here." Something moved across his face. Frustration, or maybe the ghost of something more honest. "You're doing that thing," he said. "What thing? Where you're so calm that I can't tell what you're thinking." "That's not a thing I do," she said. "That's just what I look like when I'm thinking." He stood there for a moment longer. Then he said quietly, "I didn't think it would go that far. Last night. I want you to know that." Evelyn looked at him. She let the silence sit for 3 full seconds before she spoke. "Which part?" she asked. "The necklace, the public display, or the smile?" He blinked. "What smile?" "The one you gave me after you fastened it on her," she said. "The one that told me you wanted me to see it." His jaw tightened, and she watched him decide in real time whether to deny it or acknowledge it. Watched him weigh the tactical options with the instinct of a man who had navigated difficult conversations for decades. He chose denial. She had expected he would. "You imagined that," he said. "All right," she said, and turned back to her screen. He left. She listened to the elevator descend. Then she picked up her phone and sent Rowan another message. "He's heading to the office. If anyone there asks him about the Meridian account, I want to know within the hour." She had people in that office. She had always had people in that office. Not spies exactly, but relationships. Long-term professional friendships with people who had been at Vail International since the early days, who knew what the company had been and what it had become, and who were quietly, professionally uncomfortable with the direction it had taken under Adrian's increasingly unchecked leadership. People notice things. They don't always know what to do with what they notice. Evelyn Vail had spent 2 decades being the person they called when they needed to do something with it. Her phone buzzed at 10:17, a text from a number saved only as MK. It read, "He's asking accounting to pull the Meridian subsidiary statements. Seems urgent." Evelyn read the message. She read it again. Then she set the phone down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady. Adrian was pulling the Meridian statements himself, which meant one of 2 things. Either he had seen something in the past 24 hours that had alerted him to the exposure, some flag, some conversation, some moment of belated clarity about what the necklace purchase had actually triggered, or someone in his circle had warned him. Either way, he was looking at the same thing she was looking at. The question was whether he understood what he was seeing. She picked up her phone and called Rowan. He picked up on the second ring. "I was about to call you," he said. "He's pulling the Meridian statements," she said. A brief silence. "How do you know?" "I have someone in the building." "Evelyn." Rowan's voice carried the particular tone of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation. "How long have you been watching this?" "Long enough," she said. "Rowan, if he finds the Covenant exposure on his own, if he gets ahead of this, he won't be able to contain it," Rowan said. "The exposure is too significant. Even if he tries to restructure the position himself, the counterparties are going to notice the movement, and at that point, the board finds out before we present it to them," Evelyn said. "Yes. Then we need to move faster." Another silence. She could hear Rowan breathing the particular quality of breath that meant he was thinking through something complex, mapping variables. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, "about the Meridian account. What I found this morning." "Tell me." "The necklace purchase isn't the only Covenant violation. It's not even the largest one." He paused. "Evelyn, there are transfers over the past 18 months that total approximately $31 million, routed through 3 different subsidiaries. The Meridian account is the most visible one, but there are 2 others." The number landed with the quiet weight of something that had always been there, waiting to be quantified. $31 million. "Camille," she asked. "Directly and indirectly, yes. Apartment in Tribeca held through a corporate entity, Travel, what appears to be significant professional support for a venture she's been trying to launch, and several transactions that I haven't fully traced yet, but that don't correspond to any legitimate corporate activity in the records I can access." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. She had known about Camille for 11 months. She had known the relationship was financially involved. Men like Adrian rarely kept mistresses without financial involvement, and she had noticed the small discrepancies, the unexplained line items, the occasional expense that didn't quite map to any corporate purpose she could identify. She had known it was there. She had not known it was $31 million. "Rowan," she said. "Yes, get me everything. Every transaction, every entity, every trace." Her voice was absolutely level. "I want it documented down to the last dollar." "I'll have a preliminary report to you by tomorrow morning," he said. "Evelyn, are you all right?" She almost smiled. Third person to ask. "I'll be all right," she said, "when this is done." She hung up. She sat at her desk. Outside the window, the city moved in its relentless, indifferent way, taxis and pedestrians, and the distant sound of construction somewhere to the south. The ordinary machinery of a place that did not pause for private catastrophes. $31 million. She thought about the years she had spent managing Adrian's finances, the discipline it had required, the decisions she had made, the risks she had absorbed and neutralized so quietly that Adrian had never needed to lose sleep over them. She thought about the debt restructuring in 2009 when she had worked 18-hour days for 11 weeks to prevent the collapse of a deal that would have taken the company with it. She thought about the acquisition crisis in 2014 and the investor threat in 2017 and the 47 other moments, large and small, when she had been the difference between survival and collapse. She thought about all of that. And then she thought about $31 million moving quietly through subsidiary accounts to fund a life she had known nothing about. She did not cry. She was past crying about Adrian. She was not sure exactly when she had passed that point, but it was long before the gala, long before the necklace, long before the smile. What she felt instead was something that had no precise name, a kind of cold, clarifying anger that did not heat the blood, but cooled it, that did not make you lose control, but gave you instead an almost mechanical precision of focus. She picked up her pen, she opened a fresh legal pad, and she began to write, not the timeline, not the financial documentation, something different. She wrote a list of names, the names of Vail International's board members, 12 of them. And beside each name, she wrote what she knew about them, their tenure, their relationship to Adrian, their professional backgrounds, their particular sensitivities and vulnerabilities, the specific arguments that would reach them and the ones that would not. She wrote who among them had raised quiet concerns in the past 2 years that had been dismissed, who had signed off on decisions they'd been uncomfortable with, who had enough integrity to act when presented with the evidence, and who would need to be brought along more carefully. She had sat in enough board-adjacent conversations to know this room. Adrian had always treated board management as a performance charm. Then feed them enough information to feel informed. Keep the agenda moving. He had been remarkably effective at it. What he had never understood was that the board members talked to each other outside the meetings, and some of them in those outside conversations had talked to Evelyn, not because she had solicited it, because she was the kind of person who listened, who asked thoughtful questions, who remembered what people told her and treated it with appropriate respect. She had built, without ever intending it as a strategy, a network of genuine professional trust inside a company that officially listed her as nothing more than a major shareholder's spouse. That network was about to matter enormously. Her phone buzzed again. MK. He's on the phone with legal. Closed door. Been in there 40 minutes. Adrian had found something in the Meridian statements, or someone had told him. Either way, he was talking to his lawyers on a Thursday morning, with the door closed, and that meant he was scared. Adrian Vale scared was a different animal than Adrian Vale, arrogant, more dangerous in some ways, more capable of desperate decisions, but also more likely to make the kind of mistake that comes from panic rather than calculation. She needed to move. She picked up her phone and made a call she had been planning for 3 days to a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had been on the Vale International Board for 9 years, and who had at a dinner 14 months ago said to Evelyn quietly, very quietly over dessert, while Adrian held court at the other end of the table. I sometimes wonder if we have a complete picture of this company's financial health. She had said at the time, I think that's a reasonable thing to wonder. She had filed it. She had waited. Gerald, she said when he picked up, I need 30 minutes of your time, today if possible. A brief pause, then, Evelyn, I was wondering when you'd call. She stopped. You were expecting this? Not this exactly, he said. But I've been watching the company for a while, and I've been watching Adrian for a while, and yes, I think I've been waiting for a call like this for longer than I've admitted to myself. Another pause. What do you have? Enough, she said. More than enough. Can you come to my office at 2? Yes, she said. Gerald, this conversation needs to stay between us until I've had a chance to organize the full presentation. Of course, he said. And then unexpectedly, Evelyn, whatever happens, what he did at that gala was unconscionable. I want you to know that a number of us felt that way. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Thank you, she said. She hung up. She looked at the legal pad with the list of names. She drew a small check mark next to Gerald Whitmore's name. Then she picked up the pad and went back to work. By the time she left for Gerald's office at 1:45, she had spoken to 2 other board members, carefully obliquely asking the kind of questions that plant seeds without announcing a harvest. She had received the preliminary figures from Rowan via secure email. She had verified through her own separate access to certain financial records that she had never relinquished in 23 years of marriage that the covenant violations were real, documented, and indefensible. And she had made one more call. A call she had been putting off, not because she was uncertain about it, but because it was the kind of call you make when something is truly irreversible, when you've passed from the territory of potential reconciliation into the territory of documented consequence. The call was to her attorney, not Adrian's attorneys, who were also technically her attorneys in most matters, her own attorney, whom she had retained quietly under her own name 18 months ago. It's Evelyn, she said when he answered. I need you to begin preparing the documentation we discussed for a formal separation of financial interests. Are you certain? He asked. Yes, she said. Timeline. She looked out the window. The city below, the park, the life she had built in this place out of discipline and intelligence and a capacity for work that most people in her world had chronically underestimated. We move when the board moves, she said. Not before. I want everything coordinated. Understood, he said. Evelyn, this is going to be significant for both of you. I know, she said. That's appropriate. She gathered her things. She put on her coat. She took one last look at the desk, at the legal pad, the spreadsheet, the 16 years of careful, invisible, extraordinary work that this room had witnessed. Then she walked out. In the elevator going down, her phone buzzed one more time. A number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer. Mrs. Vale. A woman's voice. Careful. slightly accented. Evelyn felt something in her chest go very still. "Yes," she said. A silence. Then, "My name is Camille Laurent. I think we need to talk." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Evelyn Vale stood very still for a moment, phone pressed to her ear, in the marble lobby of the building she had lived in for 16 years. "All right," she said finally. Her voice revealed nothing. "I'm listening." Camille Laurent's voice on the phone was not what Evelyn had expected. She had expected calculation, the careful, measured tone of a woman who had been coached by someone, possibly Adrian's people, to make contact and assess the situation. She had expected performance. What she heard instead was something rawer than that. Something that took her a moment to identify because it was the last thing she had anticipated from this particular caller. Fear. "I don't know if you'll hear me out," Camille said. "I wouldn't if I were you. I know that. But I need you to know that I didn't last night at the gala, the necklace. I didn't know he was going to do that. In public. Like that." Evelyn stood in the lobby of her building and said nothing. "Mrs. Vale." "I'm here," Evelyn said. "Keep talking." A shaky exhale on the other end of the line. "There are things you need to know. About Adrian. About the money. About what he told me about you, about the company." A pause. "I'm not calling to protect myself. I mean, maybe I am a little. I'm human. But it's not only that." "Where are you?" Evelyn asked. "The Mercer, room 412. Evelyn looked at her watch. 1:47. Gerald Whitmore's office at 2, 12 blocks uptown. She made the calculation in approximately 3 seconds. "I have a meeting at 2 that I cannot move," she said. "I can come to you at 4:30 if you're still willing to talk then." Another pause, as though Camille had expected either an immediate yes or an immediate refusal, and Evelyn's calm practicality had thrown her. "Yes," Camille said finally. "I'll be here." "Don't speak to Adrian between now and then," Evelyn said. "Not as a threat, as a statement of practical advice. If he contacts you, tell him you need space, that's all." A silence that was long enough to suggest Camille understood the implication perfectly. "Okay," she said quietly. Evelyn hung up. She walked through the lobby and out to the street and got into the car that was waiting, and she sat in the back seat for the 3 minutes it took to reach Gerald Whitmore's building, and she did not think about Camille Laurent at all. She filed it. She set it aside. She would get to it at 4:30. Right now she had work to do. Gerald Whitmore's office was on the 38th floor of a midtown building that had been built in the 1960s and had the particular gravity of a place where serious decisions had been made for 60 years. Gerald himself was 70, lean, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had spent his career being underestimated and had long since made peace with using that to his advantage. He had been on the Vale International board since the early restructuring years, since the period when Evelyn's work had quietly saved the company, and he was one of perhaps 3 people on that board who had understood even then that the stability they were witnessing was not entirely Adrian's doing. He stood when she came in. He shook her hand. He did not offer condolences about the gala, which she appreciated, because condolences would have meant treating it as a personal wound rather than a professional event, and Gerald was smart enough to understand that for Evelyn Vale at this moment, the distinction mattered. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me what you have." She sat. She opened the folder she was carrying, and she began. She was precise, and she was fast, because Gerald did not need things explained slowly. He needed them organized, which she had done. She walked him through the covenant violations, the Meridian account, the restricted fund classification, the specific language in the acquisition capital agreement that made the necklace purchase not merely embarrassing, but legally actionable. She walked him through the $31 million in broader transfers, the subsidiary routing, the 3-year pattern that Rowan's preliminary analysis had mapped. She walked him through the governance chain, the approvals that traced back to Adrian directly the board sign-offs that had been obtained through incomplete disclosures, the audit committee reports that should have flagged anomalies and hadn't. Gerald listened without interrupting. He was very still. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him, and he wrote 3 things on it during the entire presentation, which meant he was absorbing rather than noting the writing was for emphasis, not record. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How long have you had this?" he asked. The full picture 3 days, the underlying data longer. How much longer? She met his eyes. Long enough to be certain. He nodded slowly. He looked at the folder. He tapped his pen twice against the legal pad, a habit she had noticed in him during board meetings over the years, the signal that he was transitioning from receiving information to processing consequence. "Evelyn," he said, "what you're describing, if this is documented the way you say it is, this isn't a governance conversation. This is a removal conversation." "Yes," she said, "I know. Adrian will fight it. I expect him to. He has allies on the board. Harrington CO, possibly Marchetti. They've been with him for years. They're going to push back. They're going to ask for time. They're going to suggest internal remediation. I know who they are," Evelyn said quietly, "and I know what they'll say, which is why the documentation needs to be comprehensive enough that there is no defensible position for remediation. No version of this where Adrian Vale remains in a leadership role and the board retains credibility with investors and counterparties." Gerald looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of a man who is revising a long-held assumption. "You've been preparing for this for a while," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I've been watching for a while," she said. "There's a difference." He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, just a moment, and then back at her. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to begin quiet conversations with the independent directors. Not the full picture yet. Just enough to establish that there are concerns that require formal review. I need the audit committee chair briefed within 48 hours. And I need someone to formally request that the board convene an emergency session no later than 10 days from today." "That's aggressive," he said. "Adrian is already pulling the Meridian statements," she said. "He's talking to his lawyers with the door closed. If we give him 2 weeks, he will find a way to reframe this restructure, the exposure, and present the board with a narrative that buries the pattern under a single correctable error. He is very good at narratives, Gerald. You know that." Gerald knew that. He had watched Adrian Vale walk into difficult board conversations for 9 years and walk out having somehow shifted the room's understanding of what had happened so that he remained the protagonist of his own story. It was a genuine gift, and in a situation less structurally documented than this one, it might have worked again. "You're right," he said. 10 days. "Thank you," she said. She stood to leave. He stood with her, and she noticed that he was looking at her with something that went beyond professional respect, something more personal, more honest. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "After everything you've done for that company, the restructuring, the stabilization, the years of work that most people in that boardroom have no idea was yours, why does it matter to you how this ends? You could walk away with what you're entitled to and let it collapse on its own." She thought about the question. It deserved a real answer. "Because 4,000 people work for that company," she said, "and none of them put diamonds on anyone's mistress. None of them made these decisions. They just came to work." She picked up the folder. "I'm not destroying the empire. I'm removing the thing that's destroying it." She walked out. At 4:27, she arrived at the Mercer Hotel. She had spent the 3 hours between Gerald's office and this moment working calls with Rowan, a review of the preliminary financial report he had sent, 2 more careful conversations with board members who had been receptive to Gerald's initial outreach. She had eaten something at some point, though she could not afterward have said what. She had not thought about Camille Laurent again until she was in the elevator going up to the 4th floor. Now she thought about her. She thought about the fear in that voice on the phone, the rawness of it. She thought about what it meant that Camille had called her directly, had found her number, had made the decision to reach out to the wife rather than disappear into the protective buffer of Adrian's lawyers. That was either a significant miscalculation or a significant act of courage, and Evelyn needed to determine which before she decided what to do with whatever Camille was about to tell her. She knocked on room 412. The woman who opened the door was not Evelyn, noted with the particular clarity of a person seeing something they had only previously imagined what she had expected. She had expected the performance to continue. The red dress, the deliberate presentation, the beauty weaponized as armor. She had expected Camille Laurent to be up close and private, the same creature she had been in the Plaza ballroom. Instead, she found a young woman in a white hotel robe with no makeup and slightly reddened eyes, who looked in this moment profoundly 29 years old, in the way that 29 looks when it is frightened and has run out of performance. "Thank you for coming," Camille said. "Sit down," Evelyn said not unkindly, "and tell me everything." What Camille told her over the next 90 minutes unfolded in the way that confessions generally unfold, not in a clean, linear narrative, but in pieces circling back, revising, adding details, sometimes stopping entirely, while the person on the other side of it caught up to their own honesty. The relationship had started 2.5 years ago. Camille was in New York on a work visa building what she described as a consulting practice in luxury brand positioning, aspirational, underfunded, moving forward on optimism and contacts. She had met Adrian at a corporate event. He had been charming, which she acknowledged with a particular flatness that suggested she had done considerable reflecting on what that charm had obscured. He had expressed interest in her work. He had begun sending business her way, introductions, referrals, endorsements, then money framed as investment in her company. "He told me," Camille said, "that you and he had an arrangement, that you lived separately in terms of that the marriage was a business structure at this point, that you both understood this." Evelyn looked at her steadily and said nothing. Camille looked down at her hands. "I believed him," she said, "for a long time, because he was consistent about it. Because he never seemed, there was no guilt, no hesitation. It was very convincing." She paused. "The gala was his idea, the necklace. He said it was time to be public. He said you would understand, that you two had discussed it." "We had not discussed it," Evelyn said. "I know that now." Camille's voice was tight. "I knew it the moment I saw your face, or rather, the moment I saw that your face didn't change, because if you had known it would have been different. You would have been prepared, and you weren't prepared, but you also weren't surprised, not by him, just by the scale of it." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. This was, she registered privately, an accurate and perceptive read of what had happened. She did not say so. "What else?" she said. Camille looked up. "He asked me 3 weeks ago to sign something, a document. He said it was standard, a confidentiality agreement related to his business, that because I knew people in his professional circle it was a formality. His lawyer sent it. Did you sign it?" "No," Camille said. "I kept something felt wrong. The language was specific in ways I didn't understand, and I kept asking him to explain it, and he kept saying it was nothing, just standard, just sign it." She paused. "The night of the gala, after everything, I went back to the hotel, and I read it again, all of it. And I called a lawyer friend of mine in Paris." Her voice dropped. "It wasn't a confidentiality agreement. It was a liability transfer. It was written so that if anything was ever questioned about the money, the transfers, the accounts, the paper trail would point to me as the initiating party, as if the money had been my idea, my request." The room was very quiet. Evelyn looked at Camille Laurent and felt something she had not anticipated. Not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition of a person who had been used as a tool and had only just understood that this was what had happened. "He was going to make you the story," Evelyn said quietly, not a question. "Yes." Camille's voice was barely audible. "If any of it came out, the money, the accounts, I would have been the one who asked for it, the one who manipulated him. He would have been the victim." She looked at Evelyn with an expression that was some complex mixture of shame and fury. "I was going to be the villain in a story he was writing for an audience I didn't know existed." She reached into the pocket of her robe and took out a folded document. She set it on the coffee table between them. "I didn't sign it," she said, "and I kept the copy he sent me." Evelyn looked at the document. She did not pick it up immediately. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked. Camille was quiet for a moment. "Because I made choices that I can't undo. I can't make them right, but I can. I can refuse to be what he needs me to be for this to work. He needs me to be complicit, or scared enough to disappear quietly." She met Evelyn's eyes for the first time since she'd opened the door. "I'm not going to do either." Evelyn reached forward and picked up the document. She read it. It took 4 minutes. She read it with the focused attention of someone who has spent a lifetime parsing legal and financial language, which meant she caught not just the surface intent, but the structural architecture of what had been constructed, the specific clauses that would have allowed Adrian's legal team to redirect culpability, the careful crafting of definitions that made Camille's receipt of money look like solicitation rather than provision. It was not amateur work. It was the work of lawyers who were very good at building deniability structures for people who needed them, lawyers who were paid enough to be creative about it. She folded the document. She looked at Camille. "I'm going to need this," she said. "I know," Camille said, "and I'm going to need you to be willing to make a formal statement, not immediately, but when the time comes." A long pause. Camille nodded. "One more question," Evelyn said. "The business investment he made, the money he told you was going into your company. Do you have documentation of how that was structured?" Camille blinked. "Yes, contracts, bank records, email correspondence, everything." "All of it," Evelyn said. "I need all of it." "When?" "Tomorrow morning," Evelyn said. She stood. She put the folded document into her folder. "Camille," she paused. "Don't speak to Adrian. Don't respond to his lawyers. If anyone contacts you in the next 48 hours, you call me directly." She took a card from her coat pocket, her personal card handwritten number on the back, and set it on the table. "Not his people. Mine." Camille picked up the card. She held it with both hands. "Mrs. Vale," she said quietly, "I'm sorry. I know it doesn't cover what—" "No," Evelyn said. "It doesn't." She picked up her folder. "But it's a start." She walked out of room 412 and down the hall and into the elevator. And when the elevator doors closed, she let out a long, slow breath that she had been holding for approximately the last 20 minutes without realizing it. Adrian had been building an exit ramp. He had seen, or perhaps had always planned for, the possibility that the financial exposure might eventually surface. And he had been constructing in advance a narrative in which Camille Laurent was the architect of the inappropriate transfers, and he was a man who had been manipulated by a woman he had unwisely trusted. A story in which he was, as he always was, in his own telling of things, the protagonist who had been wronged. The document Camille had given her dismantled that story entirely, not just because Camille hadn't signed it, but because the document's existence, the fact that it had been prepared, sent, and carefully crafted by lawyers who knew exactly what they were building, was itself evidence of foreknowledge and intent. You don't build a liability transfer structure for a situation you didn't know was coming. She called Rowan from the car. "I need you to add something to the documentation package," she said. "What did you find?" His voice had the alert quality of a man whose instincts had just been confirmed. "Evidence of premeditated liability redirection," she said. Adrian had a document prepared to make Camille Laurent the responsible party for the financial transfers. She didn't sign it. She has the original. Silence on the other end of the line. "Evelyn," Rowan said carefully, "that's not just a governance violation. I know what it is," she said. "That changes the board conversation significantly. That's not misuse of funds by a reckless executive. That's a pattern of deliberate concealment with an orchestrated cover structure." "Yes," she said, "the board won't have a choice." His voice was very quiet. "Even the ones who want to protect him. With that document in the package, they vote him out, or they become complicit in the cover-up." "That," Evelyn said, "is exactly the point." She hung up. She looked out the window. The city moved past the ordinary, relentless city full of people living their ordinary lives, unaware that somewhere in the financial architecture above them, an empire was tilting on its foundation. Her phone buzzed. A text from Adrian. "We need to talk tonight. Please. This is getting complicated." She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on the seat. Getting complicated. As though complication was something that had happened to him, rather than something he had engineered dollar by dollar, decision by decision, over 3 years of choices that he had made, in the full belief that he was untouchable. She thought about what Gerald Whitmore had said, that she could walk away, that she had earned the right to simply leave and let the collapse happen on its own timeline. She thought about the 4,000 employees, the institutional partners, the companies that had built relationships with Vale International because they believed it was a sound, well-governed organization. All of them carrying the weight of one man's arrogance without knowing it. She thought about the liability transfer document sitting in her folder and what it said about the kind of man Adrian Vale had become, or perhaps had always been, beneath the charm and the charisma and the genuine gift for making rooms believe in him. She did not text back. At 9:45 that night, she received a message from Gerald Whitmore, Audit Committee Chair briefed, emergency board session requested for 9 days from today, 4 independent directors confirmed, it's moving. She read the message. She set the phone on her desk. She looked at the window at the city below, at the park that had been her view for 16 years. Something in her chest settled not into peace, not yet, but into the particular calm of a person who has committed fully to a direction and no longer needs to revisit the decision. The uncertainty was over. The preparation was done. What remained was the reckoning. And Evelyn Vale, who had spent 23 years being the quiet, invisible, indispensable force behind a man who had forgotten her value, was ready to walk into that boardroom and remind every person in it of exactly what they had been built on. Not with anger, not with diamonds, with the truth. And the truth she had always known was the most expensive thing in any room. The 9 days between Gerald Whitmore's confirmation text and the emergency board session were the longest and shortest 9 days of Evelyn Vale's life. Long because she was living inside them, inside every hour, every phone call, every document review, every careful conversation that had to be precise and measured and strategically timed. Long because Adrian was in the same penthouse, moving through the same space, and she was maintaining the appearance of ordinary domestic coexistence, while quietly dismantling the foundation beneath everything he believed was secure. Short because there was so much to do and the clock was always moving, and Adrian was not standing still. He had lawyers now, 3 of them plus an outside crisis communications firm that had been retained within 48 hours of the gala. She knew this because MK had told her, because the billing came through a subsidiary account she still had visibility into, and because she could read the shift in Adrian's energy as clearly as she could read a balance sheet. He was in containment mode. He was building walls. He was doing what Adrian Vale did when he felt threatened. He was performing control so aggressively that anyone watching closely could see the fear underneath it. He came to her on day 3. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, not the desk, not a formal setting. The kitchen table, which she understood, was deliberate. The kitchen table was personal, intimate. It was the terrain of a man trying to relocate the conversation from the professional to the emotional. "I know about the board conversations," he said. She looked up from her coffee. She did not ask how. It didn't matter. "All right," she said. "Gerald Whitmore." His jaw was tight. "You went to Gerald." "I had a meeting," she said. "Evelyn." He leaned forward. His voice dropped to the register he used when he wanted to sound reasonable, the controlled, slightly wounded tone that had worked on board members and investors and journalists for 20 years. "Whatever you think is happening here, whatever you think you've found, I need you to stop. I need you to give me the chance to fix this from the inside. If this goes to a full board session, if this becomes public—" "It will become public," she said. "That's not a threat. It's a structural reality. Covenant violations of this size documented and presented to a board become regulatory disclosures. You know that." "I can restructure the exposure," he said. "I've already talked to legal. There are ways to—" "Adrian." Her voice was quiet. Not harsh, simply final. "There is a document that your lawyers prepared for Camille Laurent to sign, a liability transfer agreement. Camille did not sign it. She has the original. I have a copy." The color left his face so quickly and so completely that it was almost clinical to watch. He had not known she had that. Whatever he had been told about Camille's cooperation with Evelyn, and she suspected he had been told something because he had sources, and she had always known it, he had not been told about the document. "That document," she said, "makes this not a story about a careless executive misusing funds. It makes it a story about premeditated concealment with an orchestrated cover structure. Do you understand the difference?" He stared at her. His mouth opened, closed. "Camille wouldn't—" he started. "She already did," Evelyn said. The silence between them was different from the silences they had shared before. Those had been the silences of two people who had run out of things to say to each other, or who were navigating the familiar geography of a long marriage's difficult terrain. This silence was different. This was the silence of a man discovering that the ground he had been standing on was not ground at all. "Why are you doing this?" he said finally. His voice had changed. The performance had cracked slightly, and what was underneath it was rawer than she had expected. Not calculation, but something more genuinely human. Something that surprised her. "I know I hurt you. I know the gala was... I know what it looked like. But to destroy everything we built..." "I'm not destroying what we built," she said. "I'm removing you from it." He flinched. It was small, barely visible, but it was real. "I built this company," he said. And there it was. The belief so deeply held that it came out reflexively without strategy, without the protective filters he usually kept in place. "I built this company." The conviction of a man who had told himself the story for so long that the story had become the only version of events he could access. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "Adrian," she said, "do you know what Larkspur Holdings is?" Something shifted in his expression. The name landed visibly. She could see it hit him, could see the moment of partial recognition, the name filing somewhere in his memory as familiar but not fully mapped. She had mentioned Larkspur exactly once in his presence years ago, as a reference in a financial document she had been reviewing. He had not asked about it. He never asked about it. "It's one of your investment structures," he said, uncertain. "Larkspur Holdings," she said, "is the company that holds the controlling position in the rescue financing structure that saved Vail International in 2013. When you were 48 hours from a default that would have wiped out the company entirely. When I spent 11 weeks negotiating with counterparties and restructuring $340 million in debt while you were in Tokyo closing the Meridian expansion deal." She paused. "Larkspur is mine, Adrian. It has been since I established it in 2011. You are sitting inside a company whose financial survival at its most critical moment was underwritten by a structure I built and have controlled for 15 years. The kitchen was very quiet. Adrian Vail sat across from his wife and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not in 23 years of marriage, not in any boardroom, any crisis, any difficult moment they had navigated together or separately. It was the expression of a man who has just understood at a foundational level that the story he has been living is not the story that actually happened. "You never told me," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "You never asked," she said. "You never asked about Larkspur. You never asked about the 2013 restructuring in detail. You came back from Tokyo, and the company was stable, and you accepted that as confirmation that your decision to go to Tokyo had been the right one." She held his gaze steadily. "You were very good at accepting things that confirmed the story you wanted to believe." He was silent for a long time. "So this whole time," he said slowly, "everything I thought I controlled. You controlled a great deal," she said, genuinely. "Your ability to lead, to inspire, to close deals, to build relationships that was real. I never discounted it. I never wanted to replace it." She paused. "I wanted to be the foundation it stood on, and for a long time that was enough, and now it isn't." "You made it not enough," she said. "The night you smiled at me across that ballroom while you put diamonds on another woman's throat, you made a decision about what I was worth. I'm simply agreeing with you." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that might, in a different context, have been grief. "Evelyn," he said, "I'm asking you, as the person you chose to marry, I am asking you not to do this." She picked up her coffee cup. She looked at him over the rim of it. "I know you are," she said. She stood up. She took her cup to the sink, and she walked out of the kitchen. Behind her she heard nothing, no sound of movement, no chair scraping, no voice calling after her. Just silence. The particular silence of a man sitting alone in a room, understanding for the first time the true dimensions of what he has lost. She went back to her desk. She picked up her phone. She called Rowan. "The board session is in 6 days," she said. "I want the full presentation ready in 4. I want to walk through it twice before we go in." Already building it, Rowan said. How are you? Focus on the presentation, she said. He did. The next 6 days were a specific kind of controlled chaos that Evelyn navigated the way she navigated all controlled chaos, by breaking it into components and working each component with full attention before moving to the next. Rowan's team completed the financial documentation. Her attorney finalized the personal separation filings timed to coincide with the board action. Gerald Whitmore worked the independent directors with the careful precision of a man who had spent 40 years understanding that institutional change requires not just evidence, but consensus. You needed enough people convinced enough that the vote when it came was not a surprise, but an inevitability. Adrian, meanwhile, was fighting. He was not fighting quietly. He had called board members directly, Harrington Sio Marchetti, and 2 others he considered allies. She knew this because 3 of those board members had called either Gerald or in one case directly to Evelyn to report the contact and ask with varying degrees of delicacy what was happening. The fact that they were calling, rather than simply supporting Adrian, was itself a signal. Loyalty in institutional settings has a structural quality it holds as long as the structure holds, and it begins to dissolve when the structure is visibly compromised. Adrian had told them, according to what she was hearing, that Evelyn was acting out of personal grievance, that the gala had damaged her emotionally and she was conflating personal betrayal with professional malfeasance, that the financial concerns were addressable internally and did not require board intervention. It was, she had to admit, not a bad argument. It was exactly the argument she had anticipated. It was the argument she had designed the presentation to preemptively dismantle. On the evening before the board session, she sat in her office and went through the presentation one final time. It was 47 slides. She did not look at the slides, she had them memorized. She went through it in her head, start to finish checking the architecture, the logical sequence, the moments where a skeptical board member might find a foothold for doubt, and the subsequent slides that removed those footholds. She had been building this for weeks. Really, she had been building it for years. Not this specific presentation, but the habits of mind that made it possible, the discipline of observation, the practice of documentation, the patience of someone who understood that the most powerful arguments are not the loudest ones, but the ones that leave no room for an alternative conclusion. Her phone rang at 10:45. Unknown number. She answered. Mrs. Vale. A man's voice, professional, slightly clipped. My name is Daniel Sio. I'm on the Vale International Board. I know who you are, Mr. Sio, she said. I've been speaking with Adrian, he said carefully, and I think it would be valuable to hear your perspective directly before tomorrow, if you're willing. She paused. Daniel Sio was 46, a second-generation Korean-American financier who had built his own firm before joining the Vale Board 6 years ago. He was sharp-principled in the specific way of people who have constructed their reputation carefully and had been one of the names on her legal pad that she had marked as requiring careful handling. He was Adrian's ally, but he was an ally with integrity, which meant he was the kind of ally who would withdraw support when the evidence became undeniable. I'm willing, she said. The personal angle Adrian is presenting, Seo said. He's suggesting this is grief, that you're... Mr. Seo, she said. I'm going to save us both time. The documentation I'm presenting tomorrow is not constructed from grief. It is constructed from Rowan Pierce's forensic financial analysis, verified transaction records, legal documents including a liability transfer agreement drafted by Adrian's own lawyers, and 11 years of institutional financial records that I have independent access to through Larkspur Holdings. She paused. Do you know what Larkspur Holdings is? A silence. I've seen the name in some older documents, he said slowly. I'd like to tell you about it, she said. It will give tomorrow's presentation the context it needs. She talked for 22 minutes. Daniel Sio did not interrupt once. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Why didn't you disclose Larkspur's role publicly? He asked. Years ago, when the restructuring happened. Because I didn't need to, she said simply. The company needed to be saved. I saved it. Adrian needed the credit to maintain investor confidence. I allowed him to have the credit. That was a decision I made freely at the time. She paused. I'm revisiting it now. Another silence. Longer this time. I'll see you tomorrow morning, Daniel Sio said. "Yes," she said. "You will." She hung up. She closed her laptop. She turned off the light on her desk. And she went to bed and she slept for 6.5 hours, which was more than she had slept in 9 days. The board session was called for 9 o'clock in the morning. She arrived at 8:40. She was dressed in charcoal gray, structured, precise, expensive in the way that doesn't announce itself. She carried one folder. One. Everything else was in her head. Rowan was waiting for her in the lobby. He handed her a coffee without a word. She took it, and they rode the elevator in silence, which was the right instinct on his part. There was nothing left to say about preparation. The preparation was done. The boardroom was on the 40th floor. It had floor-to-ceiling windows and a long table of dark wood that seated 14. The room was filling when she walked in. Gerald Whitmore already seated, who caught her eye and gave a single nod. The audit committee chair, Philip Nakamura, who had been briefed 48 hours ago and whose face carried the particular gravity of someone processing something they would rather not have had to process. Harrington, who was Adrian's oldest board ally, talking in low voices with Marchetti near the window. Adrian came in at 8:58. He was dressed impeccably, charcoal suit not unlike her own choice of color, which she noted with a private irony. He was holding himself well, the posture of controlled confidence, the expression calibrated between authority and accessibility. He had always been masterful at walking into difficult rooms. She had watched him do it dozens of times. He looked at her across the table, and for just a moment, just one something crossed his face that was not performance. It was something almost like pain. She looked back at him. She felt nothing she hadn't already accounted for. They sat. Gerald called the session to order. The agenda was stated formally: an emergency review of financial governance concerns at Vail International to be presented by Rowan Pierce and Evelyn Vail as representative of Larkspur Holdings. The moment the words Larkspur Holdings were stated formally in this room by Gerald Whitmore in front of the full board, the temperature changed. She watched it happen. She watched the board members who had not been pre-briefed on Larkspur's role absorb the name in the context of its formal standing as a holdings entity with institutional stake in the company, and she watched the shift in the room as that absorption reconfigured their understanding of who Evelyn Vail actually was in relation to Vail International. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had known Larkspur would be named. He had not been prepared for how it would land. Rowan presented first. He was precise, calm, and utterly without drama, which was exactly right. 40 minutes of documented financial history. The covenant violations, the Meridian account, the $31 million in transfers, the subsidiary routing, the audit committee anomalies. He presented it the way a forensic analyst presents evidence as facts, connected by documented records with no embellishment, because embellishment was not needed. When Rowan finished, Harrington spoke. These are serious allegations, but the board should consider the context in which they're being raised. There is clearly a significant personal dimension to this situation. Mr. Harrington, Evelyn said. Her voice was level and clear. I'd like to address that directly, and then I'd like to present something that I think will make the personal dimension argument difficult to sustain. She opened the single folder. She removed a document and passed copies to each board member, 12 copies prepared the night before. This is a liability transfer agreement, she said. It was drafted by Vail International's external legal counsel and sent to Camille Laurent 22 days ago. Ms. Laurent did not sign it. She provided the original to me 4 days ago, and she has given a formal sworn statement regarding its context and intent. She paused. What this document does structurally is establish Ms. Laurent as the initiating party for the financial transfers documented in Rowan's presentation. It would, had it been signed, have created a legal paper trail in which the $31 million in transfers appeared to originate from her requests rather than from decisions made by Vail International's CEO. She looked around the table. This document was not prepared in response to a personal grievance. It was prepared before the gala, before any board conversation, before any of you knew this meeting would happen. She let that land. Someone knew this exposure existed, and that someone prepared a structure to redirect it. The room was very quiet. Harrington was not speaking anymore. Marchetti was looking at the document in his hands with an expression that had gone from skeptical to something considerably more serious. Daniel Co. across the table was looking at Evelyn with an expression she recognized, not of surprise because she had told him enough the night before to remove surprise, of confirmation, of a man who had asked the right question the night before and was now watching the answer proven correct. Adrian spoke. His voice was tight-controlled, fighting to remain in the register of authority. This is being misrepresented. That document was a standard legal protection measure, a formality suggested by counsel in the event of Adrian. Gerald Whitmore's voice was quiet and very final. Let her finish. It was the first time in 9 years of board membership that Gerald Whitmore had interrupted Adrian Vale in a board meeting. The weight of that interruption settled over the room like something physical. Adrian stopped speaking. Evelyn continued. She walked them through Larkspur Holdings, its history, its structure, its role in the 2013 rescue financing. She was precise about the numbers, the dates, the counterparties, the specific terms of the rescue structure, and what it had meant for the company's survival. She did not editorials. She did not say, "I saved this company." She said the structure provided the critical liquidity that prevented the 2013 default and allowed the refinancing to proceed. The facts said the rest. She watched them understand it. She watched it move across the table from confusion to recognition to the dawning, slightly uncomfortable comprehension of what it meant that this woman, whom some of them had known for years as Adrian Vale's wife, the quiet presence at company events, the person who was always observant and rarely loud, what it meant that she had been this whole time the invisible load-bearing wall of the empire they sat on this board to govern. Harrington looked at his copy of the Larkspur documentation. "This was never disclosed to the board," he said. "It was not quite an accusation. It was a man processing something he didn't know how to hold. Larkspur's position was fully documented in the 2013 refinancing records," Evelyn said. "It was available to any board member who reviewed the complete financing structure. It was not specifically flagged because Larkspur is a private holding entity, and its beneficial ownership was not board-level disclosure under the governance rules in effect at that time." She paused. "I'm flagging it now." Another silence. Then Philip Nakamura, the audit committee chair, who had been silent through the entire presentation, set down his copy of the liability transfer agreement and looked at Adrian Vale directly. "Adrian," he said, "I need to ask you directly for the record. Were you aware that this liability transfer document was being prepared?" A silence that lasted 4 seconds, which is a very long time in a boardroom. "My lawyers prepared it," Adrian said. "Standard protective measures." "Were you aware," Nakamura repeated quietly, "that it was being sent to Ms. Laurent?" 3 more seconds. "Yes," Adrian said. The word landed like a door closing. Evelyn did not react. She had been prepared for this moment, had imagined it, constructed it in her mind, understood what it would feel like. What she had not fully prepared for was the particular quality of Adrian's voice when he said yes. The flatness of it, the deflation, like a man setting down something very heavy that he had been carrying for a long time and discovering in the act of setting it down that he could not pick it back up. Harrington leaned back in his chair. Marchetti was looking at the table. Daniel Co. was looking at his hands. Gerald Whitmore said, "I'd like to call for a brief recess, 15 minutes, and then I'd like the board to convene in closed session." Adrian looked at Evelyn across the long, dark table. His expression had moved past the performance now, past the controlled confidence and the calculated positioning and the practiced charm. He looked in this moment like what he was, a man of 52, sitting in a room that had just become legally, professionally, and permanently hostile territory. "You really did it," he said quietly. To her, just to her. Not an accusation, not quite. Something more complicated than that. Something that was almost in its directness the most honest thing he had said to her in years. "Yes," she said. "I didn't think you would." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "That was always your most significant miscalculation." The board recessed. Adrian's lawyers were called. Evelyn and Rowan waited in a conference room 2 floors down, drinking bad coffee, and not talking very much, because everything that needed to be said had been said, and what remained now was institutional process working at its own pace. Gerald came down at 12:47. He sat across from them. He looked tired in the way that people look tired after making a decision that they knew was right and that cost them something anyway. The vote was 9-3, he said. Removal from executive leadership effective immediately. The board is initiating formal proceedings for a strategic acquisition review. He paused. Hawthorne Global Infrastructure has been in preliminary discussions with the company for 8 months. They'll be brought in formally. The company will continue operating. Jobs are protected. Evelyn looked at him. And Adrian. He has the right to contest, Gerald said. His lawyers will advise him on that. But the documentation is airtight, and he knows it. He paused. Philip Nakamura is requesting that the liability transfer document be referred to outside counsel for review of potential additional legal implications. She nodded. Evelyn, Gerald said, I need to tell you something. His voice had shifted to something more personal, less boardroom. I've been in governance for 40 years. I have sat in a lot of difficult rooms, and I have never seen someone walk into a situation like this one personally, professionally, everything on the line, and handle it with the kind of discipline and integrity you just showed in that room. He shook his head slightly. What you did for this company, what you've been doing. The board needed to know. It was right to bring it to light. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The 4,000 employees needed it more than the board did, she said. Gerald looked at her. He nodded once. She stood. She shook his hand. She picked up her single folder. She looked at Rowan, who was watching her with the quiet, steady respect of a man who had known her for 16 years and had understood long before this morning what she was capable of. It's done, he said. It's done, she said. They walked to the elevator together. The doors opened. They stepped in. The doors closed, and for a moment it was just the two of them in the small, quiet space of the elevator, descending from the 40th floor of a building that would now begin the process of becoming something different, something governed by people who understood what they were governing and why. What happens to him? Rowan asked quietly. Evelyn thought about Adrian's face when he said yes, the flatness of it, the weight of it. He rebuilds, she said. Or he doesn't. That's his decision to make. She looked at the elevator doors. It was always his decision to make. He just forgot that decisions have weight. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Evelyn Vale walked out into the ordinary afternoon of a city that did not know and would not know for some time that an empire had just changed hands in a room 40 floors above the street. She walked out into it anyway. The news broke on a Thursday. Not through a leak, not through a gossip account, not through the whispering network of Manhattan's financial elite that had been humming with speculation since the gala. It broke through a formal regulatory filing, a terse, precise document that announced the departure of Adrian Vale from the executive leadership of Vale International and the initiation of a strategic acquisition review involving Hawthorne Global Infrastructure. It was written in the bloodless language of corporate governance, which made it paradoxically more devastating than any dramatic announcement could have been. There was no spin in it, no narrative, just facts documented and filed the way Evelyn Vale did everything. By noon, every major financial publication had picked up the story. By 2 o'clock, Vale International stock had moved in ways that analysts were scrambling to interpret. By 4, 3 television networks had sent crews to the building's lobby, where they filmed the entrance and spoke to sources who knew nothing firsthand, but were willing to speculate at length. Evelyn watched none of it. She was in Cincinnati. She had driven to Dana's house the morning after the board vote, not flown driven, which she almost never did anymore, because she needed the hours of highway between New York and Ohio to exist in a space that was not a boardroom, not a penthouse, not a conference room, or a hotel lobby, or any of the places where the last 3 weeks had happened. She needed the specific emptiness of interstate driving, the flat Midwestern sky. The radio she turned on and then turned off because she didn't want music or news or voices. She needed to be in motion towards something simple. Dana was waiting on the front porch when the car pulled into the driveway at 6:43 in the evening. She came down the steps before Evelyn had fully gotten out of the car. She wrapped her arms around her sister without speaking, and Evelyn, who had not cried once in 3 weeks, not at the gala, not in the kitchen with Adrian, not in the elevator after the board vote, stood in her sister's driveway in the November cold and felt something in her chest give way. It was not dramatic. It was not the collapse she might have expected. It was quiet and brief and deeply human, the kind of release that only happens when you are finally somewhere safe enough to let it happen. Dana held her and didn't say anything. She was a chemistry teacher. She understood that some reactions needed space to complete themselves. After a while, Evelyn stepped back. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at her sister. "I'm okay," she said. "I know you are," Dana said. "Come inside. I made soup." They sat at Dana's kitchen table, a round table, not the long formal surfaces Evelyn had been sitting at for 3 weeks, and Dana served soup and they talked, not about Adrian, not immediately, about Dana's students, a junior who had just won a state science competition, about their mother's garden, which Dana maintained as a kind of tribute, about small real things that had nothing to do with empires or boardrooms or diamonds. Then later, when the soup was finished and the kitchen was quiet, Dana looked at her sister across the table. "Tell me," she said simply, and Evelyn did. She told Dana everything, not the financial architecture she simplified, but the way you simplify complex things for people you love who don't need the technical version. She told her the human version, about watching the recognition drain from Adrian's face when she named Larkspur in the kitchen, about the particular quality of his voice when he said yes in the boardroom, about Gerald Whitmore's face after the vote, about Camille in the hotel room in a white robe with reddened eyes, holding a document she had refused to sign. Dana listened. She refilled Evelyn's tea once without asking. She did not offer opinions during the telling. She understood that her sister was not asking for commentary. She was asking for witness. When Evelyn finished, Dana was quiet for a moment. "Do you feel like you won?" she asked. Evelyn thought about that for a long time. "I feel like I stopped losing," she said finally. "That's different." Dana nodded slowly. "And Adrian?" "His lawyers are contesting the board decision," Evelyn said. "They'll lose. The documentation is too complete. He'll negotiate a settlement eventually. There will be governance rehabilitation conditions, probably Europe, some kind of structured redemption arc that his lawyers will frame as voluntary." She paused. "He'll survive. He's a survivor. It's one of the things I always admired about him." "Past tense," Dana noted quietly. "Most things about Adrian are past tense now." Dana reached across the table and covered her sister's hand with her own. "What about you? Not the company, not the board. You." Evelyn looked at her sister's hand over hers. She thought about the question in the way she thought about all serious questions, completely, without flinching from the difficult parts. "I'm going to need some time to remember who I am outside of that marriage," she said. "I've been Evelyn Vale for 23 years. Before that, I was Evelyn Wade, and I remember her. I liked her. She was very clear about what she wanted and very honest about what she was good at." She paused. "I think she's still in here. I think she's been waiting." Dana smiled. It was small and genuine and slightly sad. "She's definitely still in there," she said. "I've been talking to her the whole time. You just couldn't always hear her." Evelyn stayed in Cincinnati for 4 days. She slept 9 hours a night, which was more sleep than she had accumulated in 3 weeks combined. She walked in the mornings, the same street she had walked as a teenager past the Victorian house on Elm Street, where her mother's accounting firm had operated past the school, where she had first learned that numbers were a language rather than a subject. She let the familiar geography do what familiar geography does: ground you, remind you of what existed before the person you became. On the second day, she received a call from Rowan. "Hawthorne has made a formal offer," he said. "Full acquisition. The terms are strong, better than the board's most optimistic projection. Jobs are protected. The operational structure stays intact. They're keeping the senior leadership team below Adrian's level." He paused. "It's a good outcome, Evelyn, for the company." "Yes," she said. She was walking past a park she had played in as a child, and she stopped for a moment and stood still with the phone to her ear and let the news settle. "Yes, it is." "There's something else," Rowan said. His voice shifted slightly, the particular shift that meant he was moving from professional to personal, which he did rarely and only when it mattered. "What?" "I received something this morning, forwarded through your attorney, a letter." He paused. "From Camille Laurent." Evelyn had not expected that. She had not expected anything more from Camille after the sworn statement, after the document, after the formal process had absorbed her contribution and moved on. "What does it say?" she asked. "I haven't read it fully," Rowan said. "It's addressed to you. I can forward it." "Please," she said. The letter came through 20 minutes later. She read it sitting on a bench in the park, phone in both hands, the November wind moving around her. Camille had not written it like a legal document. She had written it like a person in perfect syntax sentences that ran long and then stopped abruptly, the rhythm of someone who has composed and deleted and rewritten something many times before sending it. She wrote that she had been trying to find language for what she wanted to say and had mostly failed, but that failing to find the right language was not a reason to say nothing. She wrote about the choices she had made and what she understood now about what had been done to her and what she had allowed, and where the line between those two things was harder to locate than she had previously wanted to admit. She wrote that she did not expect forgiveness. She did not think forgiveness was the relevant category. She wrote that she hoped Evelyn Vale would be given back by whatever the future looked like, the space that had been taken from her. The space to simply be herself without having to be the invisible foundation of someone else's dream. She ended with a single line that Evelyn read 3 times. "I think you are the most remarkable person I have ever encountered, and I am sorry that the first time I truly understood that was in a hotel room at the worst moment of both our lives." Evelyn looked up from the phone. The park around her, the Cincinnati sky, the ordinary Thursday afternoon of a city that had nothing to do with empires. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she put her phone in her pocket, and she walked back to Dana's house, and when Dana asked how she was doing, she said honestly, "Better than I expected." She meant it. On the 4th day, she received a different kind of communication. Not a phone call, not a letter, but a formal document from Adrian's lawyers. Not the divorce filing, which was moving through its own separate process with her attorney managing it. Something else. A request. Adrian wanted to meet. In person, not through lawyers. The request specified that no legal representatives be present, that the meeting be private, and that the purpose was, in his words, a conversation I should have had years ago. She read the request twice. She sat with it for a full day before she responded. She responded yes. They met in New York 8 days after the board vote at a small restaurant in the West Village. Not the same one she had met Rowan in, but similar in character. Unremarkable. No cameras, no audience. Adrian arrived before her, which she noted because he was almost never early to anything. He was sitting at a corner table with water and no phone visible, which was also unusual. He stood when he saw her come in. He did not try to kiss her cheek. He simply waited until she sat down, and then he sat down and they looked at each other across a small table with the particular clarity of 2 people who have nothing left to perform for each other. He looked different. Not devastated. Adrian Vale would never look devastated. It was not in his constitution. But smaller somehow. Not physically. The quality of his presence had changed. The room was not rearranging itself around him the way rooms usually did. He was just a man in a restaurant. It was, she thought, possibly the most honest version of him she had seen in 15 years. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You said it was important," she said. "It is." He looked at his water glass for a moment. "I've been trying to find the right way to have this conversation, and I don't think there is a right way, so I'm just going to say it." He looked up. "I owe you an accounting, not a legal one, a human one." She said nothing. She waited. "I knew what you were doing," he said. "Not the specifics, not Larkspur, not the full architecture. But I knew that you were holding things together that I wasn't fully managing. I knew it, and I chose not to look at it closely, because looking at it closely would have required me to acknowledge that I needed you more than I wanted to need anyone." He paused. "I was arrogant. I convinced myself that my contribution was the primary one, that the charm, the deals, the relationships, that was the real engine, and everything else was support. I let that conviction become so complete that I stopped seeing you at all. I stopped seeing you as a person. You became part of the furniture of my success. He said the last sentence as though the words tasted wrong in his mouth, which she suspected they did. "And Camille," she said. He exhaled slowly. "Camille was, I told myself it was separate, compartmentalized, that it didn't touch us, but it did touch us. It had been touching us for years because every decision I made in that direction was a decision made in the knowledge that I could, that you would manage, that the structure would hold. He met her eyes. I used your competence as permission for my carelessness, and I knew it. Not consciously, I wasn't sitting somewhere thinking that, but underneath. I knew. The restaurant around them continued its quiet business. Someone at another table laughed at something. A waiter moved past. The ordinary world. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you deserve to hear it," he said. "Not in a legal filing, not through lawyers, from me, in person." He paused. "And because I think I needed to say it out loud to understand it myself. That sounds self-serving. It probably is, but it's also true." Evelyn looked at the man across the table. This man she had chosen at 29 had built a life alongside, had supported and saved and quietly sustained through 23 years of a marriage that had started as a genuine partnership and had ended as something she no longer had a word for. She thought about what Dana had said. Most things about Adrian are past tense now. "I hear you," she said finally. "Not I forgive you. Not I understand. I hear you." Because that was the true thing, and she had decided somewhere in the 4 days in Cincinnati that she was only going to say true things from now on. He nodded. He looked at the table. "What happens to you now?" she asked. Not with cruelty, with genuine curiosity, the same curiosity that had drawn her to him in a conference room 30 years ago, the interest in a mind that was brilliant and blind in equal and adjacent measures. "Governance rehabilitation," he said, and there was a dry, self-aware quality in his voice that was new, that had not been there before the boardroom. "Europe, probably. My lawyers have been talking to a firm in London about a structured advisory role, something with oversight and conditions and regular review." He paused. "Essentially someone watching over my shoulder while I demonstrate that I can make decisions responsibly." "That's appropriate," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think you'd actually do it. Even at the end, even sitting in that boardroom, some part of me thought you'd—" "Stop," she said. "Pull back," he said. "Find a version of it that didn't require full detonation." "I tried to find that version for years," she said. "It doesn't exist. Not with someone who has stopped respecting the person they're dealing with. There's no partial accountability. There's only the whole truth, or the continuation of the lie." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, not into pain exactly, but into the recognition of pain, the acknowledgement of something real. "You were always the best decision I ever made," he said quietly. "I just didn't understand what that meant until I made enough decisions without you to see the difference." She sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her water glass. She held it without drinking. "Adrian," she said, "I want you to hear something from me the same way you wanted me to hear something from you." He waited. "I don't hate you," she said. "I want to be clear about that, because I think you might be expecting that I do, and the absence of it might confuse you. I don't. What I feel about you right now is something more like the feeling you have when you've been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and you finally set it down. There's no anger in it. There's just space. Space that I don't quite know what to do with yet." She set the glass down. "But I'll figure it out. I'm good at figuring things out." He almost smiled. It was genuine. It was the smile she had first seen across a conference table 30 years ago, not the performed one, not the boardroom one, the real one which surfaced rarely and always unexpectedly. "Yes," he said, "you are." They did not stay long after that. There was not much more to say, and both of them understood this without needing to state it. She paid her half of the check, which made him look at her briefly with something between amusement and respect, and they walked out to the street and stood for a moment on the sidewalk in the early December air. "Take care of yourself," she said. "I will," he said. "Evelyn." She looked at him. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that. 2 words, no elaboration, no qualifying language, no strategic framing, just the bare and simple thing. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. She turned and walked toward the car that was waiting at the corner. She did not look back. Not because she was angry, not because she was performing closure for an audience that didn't exist, but because looking back was not what this moment required. She had looked backward long enough. She had spent years looking backward, cataloging, understanding, building the architecture of what had happened. It was time to look in a different direction. In the months that followed, the Hawthorne acquisition was completed with the efficiency of an organization that knew what it was doing and had been given a foundation that, once the toxic leadership was removed, proved to be considerably more solid than anyone outside Evelyn's inner circle had realized. 4,000 jobs were preserved. The operational structure held. The senior team, the people who had been quietly managing the actual work of the company while Adrian managed the narrative of the company, stepped into their expanded authority with a competence that impressed even the Hawthorne integration team. Philip Nakamura, in a board communication that circulated widely in financial circles, noted that the governance failures at Vail International had been substantially contained by structural backstops that predated the current crisis language that was opaque to most readers, but that anyone who understood Larkspur Holdings could decode precisely. Rowan Pierce sent Evelyn a text the day the acquisition closed. It held all of it. She sent back, "I know." Adrian completed the governance rehabilitation program in London. He was by all accounts a different participant than he had been an executive, more careful, more genuinely curious about consequence, less interested in performing authority, and more interested in understanding it. His advisors noted the change without fully understanding what had caused it. Those who knew him well understood that a man who has had the true architecture of his life revealed to him, who has sat in a boardroom and heard the real story of his own company told by the woman he had spent years forgetting, does not come away unchanged. He did not attempt to rebuild an empire. He became quietly an advisor to smaller companies in restructuring a role that suited the skills he genuinely had without requiring the ones that had always been borrowed. Camille Laurent went back to France. She built the consulting practice she had always wanted, this time on her own terms, with her own money, with no one investing in her in exchange for things she would not put into writing. She sent Evelyn a card 2 years later, just a card, handwritten brief. It said, "I am building something real. Thank you for not destroying me when you could have." Evelyn read it at her desk, a different desk now in a different building, in a space that was entirely hers. She kept the card. Because the truth was that destroying people had never been the point. The point had never been vengeance, had never been the satisfaction of watching Adrian Vail diminished or humiliated or brought low. She had felt none of those things in the boardroom. She had felt instead the particular sober relief of someone who has told the truth in a room that needed to hear it and watched the room reorganize itself around the truth rather than around the comfortable fiction. She had removed a thing that was causing damage. That was all. That was enough. In the 3rd year after the board vote, Evelyn established the Larkspur Foundation, a restructuring of Larkspur Holdings' philanthropic capacity into a dedicated institutional entity focused on healthcare infrastructure in underserved communities. The foundation's first major project was a hospital wing in Newark, funded jointly with 2 partners she had cultivated over years of quiet professional relationships. The wing was called the Vail Infrastructure Center, which was Hawthorne's suggestion and which she accepted without comment because the name was accurate. It was in fact built from the infrastructure of everything that Vail International had once been, and she had made her peace with accuracy, even when it came attached to complicated history. The opening was on a Tuesday in April, 3 years and 4 months after a diamond necklace had been fastened around another woman's throat in a room full of witnesses who would spend years debating what they had seen and what it meant. Evelyn arrived alone. She wore charcoal gray, the same color she had worn to the boardroom, which was not intentional, but which she noticed when she caught her reflection, and thought with a small private clarity that it suited her. It always had. Dana was there. Rowan was there. Gerald Whitmore had flown in from Boston. Philip Nakamura had sent a representative who handed her a card with a personal note that said simply, "Well done." There were doctors and nurses and administrators and community members and politicians and a small press contingent that she had agreed to brief but not perform for. There were children whose families would receive care in this building. There were people whose lives would be affected in small and large ways by the existence of this place, people who had nothing to do with galas or boardrooms or billion-dollar empires or diamonds, who simply needed what this building was built to provide. She stood in the main corridor of the new wing before the official program began, in the quiet that precedes public events, and looked at what had been built. No gala, no chandeliers, no string quartet playing something European that no one was really listening to. Just walls, equipment, capacity, the structure of actual help. Dana came and stood beside her. They stood together in the quiet for a moment. "How does it feel?" Dana asked. Evelyn thought about the question seriously, the way she thought about everything seriously. She thought about the conference room where she had first met Adrian, the years of work, the quiet discipline, the invisible load-bearing walls she had built and maintained. She thought about the gala and the diamonds and the smile. She thought about the hotel room and Camille's reddened eyes. She thought about the boardroom and the word yes falling flat and final from a man who had run out of alternatives. She thought about the highway from New York to Ohio and the Cincinnati Park and her sister's kitchen table and soup. She thought about what it felt like to set something heavy down and discover that your hands free of it could build something new. "It feels," she said, "like the right size." Dana looked at her. The right size? Not too big, not performed, not built for someone else's approval. She looked at the corridor, at the light coming through the windows, at the ordinary and extraordinary fact of a building that would do good because she had decided it should. Just the right size for what it needs to be. Dana put her arm through her sister's. The program began. Evelyn Vale stepped forward into the work. She was not standing behind an empire anymore. She was standing in something she had built entirely for herself and for everyone it would serve, and it was exactly precisely enough.